Warning, this video contains personal opinions which some viewers may find offensive. Viewer discretion is advised. Also, there will be spoilers for No Way Home in this video. So, with the release of Spider-Man No Way Home, I thought it was only right to revisit all of the Spider-Man films that we've been blessed with. And oh boy, I have some thoughts. Look, I love a good superhero flick as much as the next person, but good God, some of these films are really bad and definitely don't hold up. So what better way to celebrate the web-headed hero than to create the definitive ranking of Spider-Man films? And yes, I say definitive, because my opinion is the only one that matters, and films totally aren't subjective at all, so what I say in this video is official, and none of your opinions matter. So without further ado, let's dive into it. So first off, yes, I'm including the Venom movies. Why? Well, because I have to get something out of watching these absolute trash films. If I took one thing away from this film, it's that anyone can write a Hollywood blockbuster, even a 4-year-old child. The writing in this film is on another level of bad. The first film feels awfully generic in its writing, like a bad superhero film from the early 2000s, but this clusterfuck of a script is something else. Let's start with the god-awful tone. I wasn't a fan of the quippy back and forth between Venom and Eddie in the first movie, which I'll get to, and it's safe to say that my opinion of that didn't change with this film. It's just so unfunny to me. Clearly people enjoyed it, there was enough of them in my screening laughing, but their jokes get tiresome after the first 5 minutes for me. Venom wants to eat someone, Eddie says no, haha joke. The subject matter that they're dealing with isn't inherently funny. A killer parasite is taken over someone's body and wants to kill people. Now, not saying that this means the film has to be void of humour. However, in this film, every single scene is played out like a joke, and an extremely unfunny one at that. The Venom films reek of executives making script suggestions, not to enhance the quality of the film, but to enhance its profits. This attempt at humour is a clear result of them looking at the MCU and their figures and thinking, huh, those films are funny, let's just do that. The jokes, however, wouldn't even be found near the worst MCU film. Well, maybe Thor: The Dark World. But it just goes to show that there's a clear misunderstanding of the text they're adapting from. Venom is meant to be scary, not whatever unfunny mess we got. Not to say that they couldn't have made the film funny, but if you're going to make him funny, then make him funny. The film is also riddled with plot holes, and with a tight 90-minute runtime, you'd think someone would have spotted them. But no, this is a money-making machine, not a film. Alongside these numerous plot holes is just some of the dumbest shit I've ever seen in a film. Before I get into the bad, I'll hand it to them. The Mulligan reveal that he was the cop who shot Shriek was a bit of a shock. I'm really grasping at straws though. But for now, the bad. I thought it'd be fun to give you some of my favourite plot holes / what the fuck moments from this masterpiece of a film. When Eddie visits Cletus before he's going to be executed, Venom attacks him in broad daylight. Then Cletus bites Eddie and talks about how the blood tastes different. Yet Carnage, nor the security guard who was sitting in the room, mentions the fact that they just saw a massive tendril fly out of Eddie. They literally know he's Venom and never say anything. Cletus is only going to be executed after Eddie found the bodies, yet he was still tried and found guilty, so why does evidence confirming what they already deemed right mean that his sentence changes and he's sent for execution? When Eddie first goes to see Cletus, his room is open with all his scratchings on the wall. Also, why would you have put all the important information and locations on the wall? Besides the point. And Eddie, the supposed incredible journalist, is going to walk away. Then Venom, this weird alien who's been on Earth for a few months, is the one to say, that stuff might be useful. Guess Venom went to journalism school on his planet. And the fact that Carnage apparently has his own internet inside him that he can access on a computer by fingering the ports. I have a list that goes on and on and on about this movie, but I will stop for my sanity and yours. It's just baffling to me that a Hollywood film was allowed to be made with this many mistakes and weird plot holes in it. Another thing that is bound to make you sad about this movie is seeing Academy-level actors give performances that belong on the Disney Channel. And honestly, that's being generous. Tom Hardy is atrocious. He's bafflingly bad, from his god-awful accent that sounds like a 3-year-old who hasn't learned how to speak properly yet, to his general persona. Eddie Brock isn't a real person. The way he acts in this film is so cartoony, I don't know how he functions as a human. Let's also mention the amazing supporting cast. Michelle Williams, who just flat out doesn't need to be in this film. literally contributes nothing but a foil for Eddie at the end that feels like a plot point ripped from the pages of the first draft of a 2004 superhero film. Woody Harrelson at least has some fun with his role, I guess. The lines he's fed are awful and so are his wigs, but at least he was having a good time. But Naomi Harris, I don't know what went wrong. Harris has a horrific accent, one that could rival Tom Hardy's for the worst voice work, that makes her sound so childish and not threatening at all. Granted, she had the worst out of the bunch to work with. Her lines are a crime to screenwriting, but her performance paired with the writing just made for a completely unbearable character. It's really upsetting to me that this pile of shit was made as a clear cash grab and it's making money, yet original ideas like The Last Duel bombed at the box office. I think it would be different if this was a decently made film with an intention to be entertaining, smart, cinematic, while also making money, but this is just disappointing that this is what can be classed as a Hollywood blockbuster now. I've already spoke too much about Venom, so I'm gonna keep this one short. It's so baffling to me that this came out in 2018 and not the early 2000s. In the last few years, we've had superhero films that can be more than that they tell deeper, meaningful stories, or are just fun-filled films with great characters. This is a pile of shit. It's so generic in its plot and characters and does nothing to hide this, other than make the tone of the film a confusing mess. I can't actually tell if Tom Hardy is making a smart acting choice playing Eddie as weird as he does, or if he's just being weird for weird's sake. There's no development of any of the side characters, and the villain is the most generic bad guy in the world. And how come he has a company of people working for him when he's clearly this evil, awful person killing people? Often superhero films with bad plots can be redeemed slightly by some cool action. But this film is just CGI blob versus CGI blob. That's never appealing to look at all. But we got Tom Hardy climbing into a fish tank and eating a live lobster. So there's that, I guess. Okay, I fully went into this movie expecting a train wreck, due to public perception of the film and just the general track record of how I enjoyed the Raimi trilogy up to this point. However, to my surprise, I think this film has a decent first 50 minutes. That I was actually confused as to why this film garners so much hate. And then suddenly Peter Parker decides to put his hair over his eyes in an emo look, acting like the perfect symbolism for the glorious horrible film that follows. It's clear that within this muddle mess of a movie, there is something there. There's a compelling story hidden underneath this bizarre hodgepodge we got. Specifically, this is the story involving Sandman. Everything with him felt entertaining and had a lot of heart behind it. Ignoring the quick twists in his character at the end and the unearned redemption, his arc throughout the story was a good setup just with a bad resolution. This can be said for a lot of things in the film. There's some great setup that never gets resolved, or big moments that have no setup whatsoever, so lack any emotion behind them. The most egregious of these is the whole third act. For no real reason, both the villains and the heroes team up for a lackluster battle, and then after killing people and wreaking havoc, suddenly Sandman is given redemption? In isolation, this third act isn't bad, but with the prior context of the scenes that came before, it doesn't work at all. The holy trinity of Peter, MJ, and Harry are at their most insufferable in this film too. Peter is just completely unlikable, and this isn't because of the symbiote. Peter kisses Gwen before this ever happens, on the night he's going to propose to MJ. And then, even when he has the symbiote, does the movie really think that this condones him backhanding MJ? He's just completely unlikable throughout this entire film. His relationships with every single character aren't believable, so this takes away any attachment to the scenes since you're not rooting for Peter throughout the film at all. If you thought that Raimi might actually make MJ a three-dimensional character to end the trilogy, ooh, you'd be wrong. Poor Kirsten Dunst. MJ is literally a damsel in distress in this film and is exploited for loving Peter again. I don't know how she still goes back to him after he slapped her, kissed another girl on the night he was going to engage to her, and treats her like shit. But nothing in this film makes sense, so yeah. James Franco ups the insane comedic take of his Harry Osborn, and while it makes no sense and it's so stupid plot-wise, I can't say I was bored watching him. The whole amnesia stuff though was so dumb. Also, slight aside, but if these three were really good friends, as we're told multiple times yet after 3 movies are never shown, why would he have not told MJ, hey, your boyfriend killed my dad, you should leave him? And then his sudden turn to help MJ is just so dumb and unearned, despite them teaming up being kind of sick. There's just so many more plot points and characters I could get to that just don't add up. But as an example of how bad the writing of this film is, they introduce Gwen Stacy, an iconic Spider-Man character who has so much backstory in the comics and is intrinsic to Spider-Man, and this film reduces her to a model in a science class that apparently doesn't know science. This movie has a lot of memeable content though, so that's something. How many times can one person say Oxford in a single sentence? Well, strap in, because this film will test those limits. This is the most disappointing of the Spider-Man films for me, as it had the potential to be amazing. Once again, in the web duology, the only truly good thing about this cinematic foray into the webhead story is the core relationship between Peter and Gwen. Yet unlike the first film, the other components surrounding this aren't fine or even passable, they're actively harming the quality of the film. Garfield and Stone continue to be absolutely insatiable as Peter and Gwen, both producing performances that are far above the quality of this film. While their will they, won't they is very heavy-handed, basing it around Peter's promise to her dad works well for me, as it's clearly eating Peter up inside being torn between two options. Webb just has a talent for directing these small rom-com moments, and that's where this film shines. All this push and pull, however, leads to one of my favourite Spider-Man moments brought to screen, the death of Gwen Stacy. This scene is beautifully horrific. The tragedy of the situation and how heartbreaking it is comes through in the outstanding performances, but also the score and cinematography. It's truly one moment in the film where everything comes together seamlessly to produce something incredible. Outside of this movie is all over the place though. The one other thing that is sort of done well is the heart-to-heart moments between Peter and Aunt May. However, this isn't due to great writing, it's just another instance of the performances elevating a bad script. There's numerous violations of good screenwriting in this film. Aunt May's weird nursing plotline, Harry Osborn's accelerated insanity, the awful parent subplot, but the worst offender has to be Max Dillon. Electro in this film had the potential to be a great villain, a man who was ignored and neglected by society so much that it pushed him to the brink, and once he finally gets noticed for doing bad, the attention is so infectious that he can't stop. Instead, what we were presented with is this over-the-top and completely on-the-nose representation of a man who feels like no one notices him, to the point where he sings to himself happy birthday and calls out every time someone knows his name. The worst thing about this is that it's played for jokes though. The serious tone that was so unique about the first film is absent here, and it makes what could have been such a sad story a bad attempt at comedy. Electro has just wasted potential both of the character and of the acting of Jamie Foxx, who can't do anything to save this role. Technically, this film isn't any better. It is some of the worst edited action scenes ever. Pair that with the lackluster direction of these scenes, and any action scene becomes a slog to get through. Minus the power station scene, which was quite well done. This might also be the worst Hans Zimmer score to exist, but also being quite a fun score at the same time. There's moments where the score shines and it really enhances the grandeur of the scenes, but then there's atrocities like the music behind the Times Square scene, where out of nowhere suddenly these creepy voices start shouting at Max, despite this being non-diegetic, but we're supposed to believe that he can hear it? It's awful either way, the voices are so distracting that it just pulls you out of the film. Accompanied by this awful score is equally awful needle drops. When Peter's trying to solve what happened to his parents, and this indie Mumford & Son-esque music starts playing, it feels completely misplaced. And then 2 minutes later, Kid Cudi starts playing. It's so jarring and again is so distracting from what's going on. However, perhaps the biggest achievement of this film is the absolute banger by Kendrick Lamar and Alicia Keys that plays over the credits of this film. I played that song way too much when this first came out. Yeah, this is where Raimi fans will begin to hate me. I haven't watched this since I was a child, and not like the age where watching it now I'm filled with nostalgia. I watched this super young, so apart from a few iconic scenes, this felt like a brand new watch. And this movie isn't great. I know some people adore this film, but there's just too many things that irked me that didn't make this the enjoyable watch I thought it would be. The best thing this film has going for it is how it feels like a pure comic book come to life. It's campy, ridiculous superhero fun for the most part, that while there might be some problems, you can't help but smile throughout. But man, there's some glaringly awful elements to this film. MJ's writing, which I've mentioned before, is horrific. I mean, she's just used to further Peter's plot. The whole relationship between her and Peter is awful and screams of the typical nerd fantasy trope. She confesses her love to Peter at the end. Why? That dynamic has always been one way throughout the entire film, and then suddenly it flips at the end. Also, Peter is a literal stalker in the film. There's multiple scenes where he's just following MJ, and honestly it's kind of uncomfortable. Peter as a character in this film just isn't fun. Maguire plays him with so little emotion, unless he's crying, that makes him so uninteresting to watch. And the VO is as egregious as Harrison Ford's in Blade Runner. There's lots of other nitpicks I had, like why does Green Goblin want to kill Spider-Man? How did Peter make the suit? Why does Green Goblin have nuclear bombs? Why is Harry such an awful friend? They just all amount to a clumsy film. Raimi manages to capture the feel of a comic book film with none of the character, and that just amounts to a passable origin film with some iconic moments sprinkled throughout. However, Willem Dafoe is incredible. I just wish the other actors could have matched his energy throughout. Much like the Raimi trilogy, there's a plethora of issues with The Amazing Spider-Man, but it is one thing that trilogy never did: chemistry. To me, this film is truly the anti-Raimi Spider-Man film. The fun, comical tone is gone and replaced with a more gritty, serious one. The romance between the two main characters feels natural and sensual and not creepy and completely nonsensical. The casting of the characters is just pitch perfect, with phenomenal actors really enhancing the script, and not lines given with monotonic delivery and no emotion. I can't stress enough how good of a casting Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone are as Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy. Are their characters expertly written? No. However, the ability for these actors to sell their lines and weird character choices is nothing short of great. The pure electric chemistry between the two is just something else. There are moments where you feel like you shouldn't be watching them, like you've just invaded their privacy. You believe that they're in love, and despite some strange dialogue, every conversation is so sexually charged between them that it doesn't really matter. While Parker's character is a little muddled, going from angsty teen to nerdy teen to cool teen with no real reason, his Spider-Man is on point. The quippiness and the playfulness of his hero is far more inviting and entertaining to watch than Maguire's understated Spider-Man. The whole journey we get with Peter becoming Spider-Man was so natural and fun to watch. This slow progression to how he becomes the friendly neighborhood hero was far more enjoyable to watch, albeit less iconic than Maguire. However, while this may be the anti-Raimi film, it also feels like a cheap imitation of the original. Beat for beat, this is the same as the original Spider-Man film. And while you might think, well, that's obvious, it's an origin film and there isn't much room to change that story, there's direct minutiae that are in the original that exist here, like the whole Uncle Ben scene being indirectly Peter's fault and him tracking down the criminals who killed him. But what's also weird is that this film tries so hard to avoid being an imitation of Raimi's, like the classic "with great power comes great responsibility" scene, that instead in this film becomes Uncle Ben rambling for a minute, implying this sentiment, yet never saying these words.
But your father lived by a philosophy, a principle really. He believed that if you could do good things for other people, you had a moral obligation to do those things. That's what's at stake here. Not choice, responsibility.
Webb, coming off of 500 Days of Summer, has expertly showed his ability to direct romantic scenes, and the scenes between Peter and Gwen are the best in the film, to no surprise. However, it's clear that Webb isn't an action director, and in a superhero film filled with action, this makes many of these scenes, which are supposed to be grand, fall flat. Even in the worst of the Raimi trilogy, there's notable action scenes that are iconic, which can't be said about any in this movie. However, there's some good cinematography, and there feels like some choice was put into how the film looked to fit the tone, and it did it well. This film just goes to show the power of acting though. When this film is good, it's great. The character dynamics feel so natural and you get invested in their relationships. However, for a film to be good, there still needs to be a compelling plot and a story you're invested in, with a well-written script that actors don't have to try their best to make passable. Spider-Man 2 is a vast improvement over its predecessor, but claiming this is alongside The Dark Knight as objectively incredible comic book movies is baffling to me. This isn't the masterpiece so many believe it to be. I'll start off with the good though. Alfred Molina. Doc Ock is the reason this film works as well as it does. The campy horror of Doc Ock, masterfully envisioned by Raimi, fits the tone of this film perfectly, allowing for some horrifying scenes, but also moments of complete charm too. While a sort of rehash of the same motivations as Green Goblin and a lack of connection to Spider-Man, this movie sells Doc Ock through its creative action set pieces and having his conflicting sides more apparent. Again, Raimi manages to capture the perfect comic book tone, even more so in this film. It feels like comic pages have come to life on screen. However, there's still a plethora of issues with this film, and most of them can be boiled down to the holy trinity of the trilogy. I mean, at this point, I just feel bad for Kirsten Dunst. This film continues the awful mess of a character that is Mary Jane Watson. They don't know what to do with her and reduce her to a one-dimensional person for Peter to obtain yet again, which is just highly upsetting considering how integral she is to Peter in the comics and in other stories. This film doesn't even know the relationships they've set up in prior movies. Apparently in this movie, they've been best friends since childhood, yet in the last one, Peter was stalking her and couldn't even speak to her. Thematically, this movie could be interesting, with Peter dealing between living two different lives and having to choose between them, possibly giving up what he wants for the greater good. And Aunt May delivers a really good speech that speaks to this theme. However, the film ends in a place that Peter has made the decision to be Spider-Man and has had to give up his chance with Mary Jane, because with great power comes great responsibility. Yet Mary Jane then abandons her fiancé to go to Peter at the end, and suddenly that whole thematic build-up is squandered, as Peter now has everything he wants. It's just so frustrating that they couldn't commit to this idea when they had spent so much time justifying this theme and had nearly nailed it. There's many debates online as to who the best Spider-Man is, and I have no idea how someone can say Maguire. His Peter Parker isn't likable, and I stand by this. I don't know if it's in his performance or his characterization, but at moments Peter is insufferable. It also doesn't help that unless Maguire has a strong emotion, he delivers lines with no fluctuation in tone and makes conversations between him and most of the other characters, not Doc Ock, those scenes are great, so lifeless. And one such person Peter has awful conversations with is Harry. James Franco works with what he's given in this, but much like Dunst, he can't elevate the awful writing. He finds out that Peter has killed his dad, and that conversation is just shut down immediately, and we don't get any tension or resolve from it. And why the fuck does he have the same weird mind stuff going on as his dad? He wasn't hit by the goblin gas at that point. He's just such a wasted character, and the dynamic between these three best friends is atrocious. This isn't how friends act with each other, and more so, they don't even seem like friends at all in this. While Raimi might have nailed the film tonally and built amazing action scenes that are still iconic to this day, unless you can nail interpersonal relationships and characterization of your main characters in the film, then the film isn't gonna hold up. While this isn't the typical Spider-Man story we're used to, Spider-Man Homecoming is a thoroughly refreshing addition into the catalogue of ever-expanding Spidey movies. Many of the more recent films in the MCU feel like they have a director behind them, carefully bringing to life their vision, infusing their films with signature styles and unique creative storytelling. However, I'd never really considered John Watts to be amongst these directors, until rewatching this and Far From Home back to back. Watts manages to capture the essence of a John Hughes teen comedy while perfectly intercutting a great superhero story at the same time. This is the first Spider-Man film that actually feels like it takes place in a real school. The characters don't feel like over-exaggerated caricatures, but real lived-in people. This isn't just apparent in the main cast, but all the small characters and the extras in the background too, making little comments and feeling like real people. It just makes the world feel more real and lived in. The main cast of characters are really the stars though. Tom Holland's Peter Parker and Spider-Man are perfect. He mixes the awkwardness of Tobey's Peter with the cool charm of Andrew's to great effect, resulting in a Peter who feels like a real nerdy kid. The best thing about this Peter in the film is that when he's with Ned, they're cool because they think they're cool, just like normal nerds. Within their bubble, building a Lego Death Star is really cool to them, but it's only when you view them outside their bubble, like through Flash, that they become the uncool kids. Peter and Ned's relationship is one of the best duos in the MCU. They have this effortless back and forth with each other that is so enjoyable to watch. They just feel like really good friends. Ned himself as a character is just endlessly likable. Jacob Batalon does such a great job at making Ned as inviting as possible, and his curiosity and wonder about his friend's superpowers is infectious. It's also so smart how they use MJ in this film. Having her be there but not really be focused on really sells the arc of her and Peter's romance. Even though there's a lot of great performances in this film, there's one that truly shines above the rest though: Michael Keaton. The MCU has had a long history with poor villains who are underdeveloped, underutilized, and generic. However, the Vulture is anything but these things. The film opens with Adrian Toomes and immediately grounds the film and his character as being one who the audience can sympathize with. His motives, which are expertly told to Peter later in the film, aren't simply to destroy the world. He desires to take power away from the wealthy and give back power to the little man, of which he views Peter as being. Much like the other top tier villains in the MCU, the thing that makes the Vulture great is that you can see exactly where he's coming from. His reasonings are not convoluted, they make sense. He just perhaps goes about this in the wrong way. The twist that happens in the film might also be one of the best Spider-Man moments put to screen. The slow build of tension from the front door of Liz's house all the way to the school is incredible, and Holland and Keaton's performances are just magnificent in this moment. The panic in Peter's eyes and face as he doesn't know how to handle this revelation, and the rising suspicion in Toomes as he figures out what's going on as the lights turn green is Spider-Man perfection. The main criticism that this film garners is that it's too intrinsically tied to Tony Stark and doesn't feel like a Spider-Man film. However, this isn't one that I totally agree with. For one, in the context of where the MCU is at this moment, and the 5 previous Spider-Man movies that precede this in quick succession, it doesn't make sense to make this the classic Spider-Man story, since by now we all know that story already. Moreover, this film benefits from not being constrained to tell that story that has been told so many times, and can explore telling a new Spider-Man story in the amazing world building of the MCU. It's also thematically ingenious, as it's really a journey of Peter learning what Spider-Man means to him without the tech and the input of Tony Stark. But the irony is that this main theme of the film is the thing that annoys people the most about it. Tony's appearance is necessary in the film due to how this Spider-Man was introduced in the MCU, but this film allows Peter to decide what he wants Spider-Man to mean to him. Peter's decision to leave behind the heroic life of being an Avenger and opting to live a normal high school life where he is a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man is a subtle but strong indication of the mark Adrian left on him, that he feels a responsibility to look out for the little guy because no one else will. This is just all round a fantastic film. Comparatively with the previous ones, this one is far more subtle with its themes and focused on telling a good story with relatable characters that feels like they exist in the real world. It is some of the best comedy in the MCU alongside some of the most creative action. Making Spider-Man face open areas and heights was such a smart decision, as it puts him in a place where he doesn't have the upper hand. It's so good at blending all these genres and elements together that it makes for one of the most enjoyable entries in the MCU. This film is the essence of with great power comes great responsibility. Instead of giving Peter this speech, he learns this lesson throughout the course of the film, opting for a show don't tell approach that works perfectly. Watts continues his masterful way of telling 2 stories simultaneously to great effect. This film manages to blend a teen road trip movie with the internal struggles of being a superhero, and both manage to complement and accentuate the other's ideas and themes perfectly. Holland's Spider-Man is thematically my favourite. In Homecoming, he learns to appreciate being a ground-level hero and wants to look out for the everyman. Then he's thrust back into big-scale action in Infinity War, until he's blipped away and comes back 5 years later to a brand new world that's struggling to rebuild. Then after 8 months, he finally gets a break to spend some time with his friends away from the limelight of being Spider-Man and the work he's had to do in restoring New York with everyone back. However, things don't go his way and responsibility is thrust upon him again. Despite this being the last thing he wants, he tries so hard to pawn the responsibility onto someone else. He tries to give the glasses to Quentin Beck. He ignores Nick Fury's calls multiple times. He leaves his suit behind. He just wants a break from the need to be a superhero and to live his life as a normal teenager. Then, in what's one of the best moments in the film, Peter gets to admit to Happy why he's been struggling to be this superhero the world wants him to be, and it's that he's scared that he can't fill the shoes of Tony Stark. Peter idolized Tony, and for the world to suddenly expect him to take on this mantle is daunting to Peter. And moreover, he hasn't really had the time to process this grief. So this is all coming from a place of hurt. Pair this with the constant reminders everywhere of Iron Man and Tony. Peter begins to break, and he finally gets to confide this in Happy. But this conversation allows Peter to come into his own, as he's helped to realize that nobody will be like Tony, but Tony trusted him and that's all that matters. Happy's look that he gives Peter as well is just a genuine moment of care, as he's also grieving Tony, but seeing a piece of him in Peter that gives him hope for what he'll do. The performances continue to be outstanding in this film too. Tom just fully embodies everything that Peter Parker should be, both in and out of the suit. All his school friends are brilliant too, especially Ned and Betty, and also MJ getting more development in this film was great, and the relationship developing felt natural and real. This film does two things that are so smart with MJ. One, letting MJ figure out Peter was Spider-Man was so well done, and tying it into the fact that she likes him was such a great decision too. Instead of it being Peter obsessing over a girl who doesn't like him, making their feelings go both ways was just a smart choice. And two, having MJ be the one to make the first move is incredible, because it's exactly how this would happen in real life. Peter is so awkward he didn't have the guts to ask MJ out or make the first move. He wanted things to be perfect and had a plan to do it, but MJ just does it spontaneously, and moreover, the relationship actually feels like a real teenager relationship. It's not really sensual like Garfield and Stone, and it actually exists unlike Maguire and Dunst. It's incredibly cute and exactly how a relationship at this age would feel. Also, the Watts movies are 2 for 2 with their villains, as Jake Gyllenhaal knocks it out of the park. Mysterio being built up to be a good guy far longer than you expect is ingenious, as it allows him and Peter to cement a real relationship that makes the twist hurt more. The film tricks you as it sets up Mysterio to be this new dad figure for Peter, someone who also understands what it means to be a superhero, which makes it all the sadder when he turns as Peter really trusted him. Gyllenhaal's performance is magical, as he plays this friendly hero perfectly, but also the maniacal menace that's bubbling underneath. When he goes unhinged, every scene with him is just so fun to watch, and tying his backstory to Tony and trying to break free of his shadow is brilliant, as it mirrors the theme of the film that Peter is struggling with. The way that Mysterio's powers are brought to life in this film is beyond smart, as it feels real in this world. Having a team behind him as well makes all the illusions feel believable. It also leads to one of the best scenes in the MCU or any Spider-Man film ever, the full Mysterio illusion. It's just genuinely fantastic. The action, the visuals, the way it's used in the story, the layers of the illusion. It's one of the most creative and innovative scenes in the MCU. This movie just feels so John Hughes in the first half, mixed with an incredible superhero drama in the second, that it's hard not to love if you're a fan of either. Pair this with some great twists, visuals, actions, and music by Michael Giacchino, which is some of the best in the MCU, then it makes for an absolute treat of a film. A film franchise hopes and dreams to have a film in their catalogue that transcends what a normal film is, to become something more, to be an event in cinema that is collective praise and shock for what is witnessed on the screen. Marvel now has 3 successfully under their belt, each as mind-blowing and cinematically shocking as the last. Under the watchful eye of Kevin Feige, Marvel just isn't missing, proving time and time again that they are masterful storytellers. On his press tour, Tom Holland reiterated multiple times that this is the culmination of 3 generations of cinema. And what's mad is that this film isn't just that, it's a faithful and successful story that ties together 20 years of cinema. As a Spider-Man fan, and moreover as a fan of Watts films in particular, this film delivers on all fronts, giving me all I wanted and more. Part of my fear going into this film was that it would be so overfilled with storylines, new characters and new concepts, that it wouldn't be able to deliver on a thematically resonant and concise story for Tom Holland's Spider-Man. Yet, my fears were misplaced. The story that's told in No Way Home is a quintessential modern Spider-Man story that fully allows Peter to come into his own by the end of it, and it manages to tie together the themes and ideas of the first 2 films as well, perfectly. Many complain that Tom's Spider-Man isn't good because he was handed everything to him from Tony Stark, or that the plots of the previous films aren't faithful to the comics, or that he hasn't suffered enough like all the other Spider-Men. And while I completely disagreed with this while watching the first 2 Watts films, as I believe they're just good examples of world building and unique stories that just happen to feature Spider-Man, this film wraps up the narrative of the trilogy in such a special way that I would find it hard for anyone to make these complaints now. If the first film is viewed as Peter discovering what Spider-Man means to him, without all the gadgets or the suits, trying to get to the core of what makes Spider-Man, Spider-Man, and the second film is viewed viewed as Peter overcoming the shadow of Tony Stark and learning to deal with the responsibility of being a hero, then this third film can be viewed as the perfect end cap, a story where Spider-Man learns the consequences of his actions and has to take responsibility for it, but also as a hero learning that it's his responsibility to see good when others don't. In this way, the ending to this film mirrors Tony's decision in Endgame, with Peter making what is an ultimate sacrifice, thus allowing the trilogy to come full circle with the idea of Peter being the new Tony Stark. As Happy said in Far From Home, even Tony couldn't live up to the idea of Iron Man, and that's exactly what happens here. Peter makes the decision for the greater good, because it's what he must do as a hero, not because he's trying to be heroic. This touching sentiment is brought home in the film many times, but in particular by Aunt May, in what is one of the most heartbreaking moments in the MCU to date. Subverting the prototypical Spider-Man story and having Aunt May deliver the iconic "with great power comes great responsibility" line was an ingenious decision, as the weight this scene held was far heavier than any other previous iteration of the scene. Having Aunt May be a well-rounded character that audiences have spent time with makes this sacrifice hurt so much more. May has always seen the good in people, even if we've only seen this in the background of previous films. But in this film, her compassion and belief in kindness comes through tenfold, and through Marissa Tomei's exquisite performance, this is easily the best iteration of the character to exist. Speaking of best iterations of iconic characters, I think it's undeniable that Tom Holland is the best Spider-Man. I've always found Holland's performances to be emotionally charged, elevating what can often be very goofy dialogue, yet the performance here he showcases in No Way Home is nothing short of brilliant. While maintaining the character of Peter we've all become so used to and love, he's also able to deliver deep sadness and rage that doesn't ever feel out of place, but is always so guttural that you believe Peter at every step. Tonally, this film switches around a lot, yet it never feels disjointed. It does manage to flow consistently, and that in part can be attributed to the performances on offer in the film. Most of the acting in the film is incredible. The main trio in this film allow it to still remain in part a high school comedy. Zendaya and Jacob Batalon are standouts. In a film where there's a lot of other big players, I was worried that these two would be neglected, but they have some of the best moments in the MCU. Ned continues to be a comedic delight, and the hints to him with magic were completely unexpected, but completely welcome. Zendaya expectedly is outstanding. She's just a great supporting character in all meanings of the word. She is her own character, but she also brings out the best in everyone she's acting opposite. The moment where she is saved and the little "are you okay" she says is acting at its finest. The standout of the film though has to be Willem Dafoe. My god. Willem said he would only do this film if he did all his own stunts, and I'm so glad he did, because he was completely unhinged in this film. He takes the Green Goblin from Raimi's trilogy to inconceivable heights, resulting in one of the greatest comic book villains of all time. Dafoe's performance is something out of a full-on horror film. He's enticingly creepy and utterly frightening. Anytime the Goblin came out, there was genuine fear as to what would happen, as he felt like a threat. His softer side being allowed to shine through as well I thought was a nice touch, as it added some much needed weight to the villains. The other villains on offer here range from fantastic to passable. Now, the MCU has obviously taken some creative liberties in how they decided to characterize the villains, but never did it feel completely unreasonable or out of place. Molina, both before and after his chip was replaced, was incredible and continued his brilliant performance as a good man who was corrupted by something outside of his control. His dynamic with Holland's Peter was really fun too, and the two had some great back and forth dialogue. The rest of the villains weren't particularly impactful. Some of the dialogue they had wasn't great, especially Electro, and some weren't even given that much to do. However, on the whole, this never felt like a problem, as the way they were utilized in the final act was great. The biggest complaint I've seen of this film is that it's just fan service. Now, while I don't disagree that this film is saturated with fan service, it's full of meaningful fan service that in turn services the plot. Everything comes together in a way that both excites fans and drives the plot forward. Tobey and Andrew's inclusion was delightful and completely unexpected in the way they were introduced. I loved that MJ and Ned were the first to interact with them, and that scene was such a fun place setter to show how they're still the same characters but have grown up since we've last seen them. Everything with Tobey and Andrew was fantastic. The quips between the three of them, the shared trauma they all have, and the way in which they stopped Holland's Spider-Man going down a path they knew would lead to darkness. It was all handled so carefully. Also, this film cements the fact that Andrew Garfield is the best working actor at the moment. That small moment with MJ is heartbreaking. Also, we got Matt Murdock back. What's not to love? I don't need to say why this is number one. What more can be said about this film that hasn't already been said, so I'll keep it short. It's visually, narratively, structurally, sonically, and creatively perfect. Somehow, it's an origin film, a team-up film, and a multiverse film all in one, and it nails every aspect of the story. Because at the center is a story about Miles and his journey learning that anyone can wear the mask. Daniel Pemberton's score is so underappreciated too. His music makes scenes feel so grand and dramatic, and the soundtrack is utilized so well in this film, especially in the leap of faith scene, which is one of, if not the best Spider-Man scene put to screen. Sony has made something special here with this film, and it will be hard to top it. Well, there you go. That's the definitive Spider-Man ranking. If you want to propose other rankings, I guess, you can go ahead in the comments. Please be civil though, and Raimi fans, please don't come for me. Let me know if you like this sort of video and suggest some other franchises or directors I could rank. Also, if you want to know my thoughts on films, trailers, film news, that sort of thing, or are looking for some film recommendations, I'm super active over on Instagram, so go give me a follow if you want to keep up to date with what I'm watching. And before you go, don't forget to let me know in the comments below what you found in frames.